Thanks also from my side for this opportunity to participate in a day which is, in fact, as it has been said at the beginning, opening a possibly important intensive process of assuming the case of the Rohingya people as one of the critical cases which must be faced by the international community in order to at least put into practice some of the principles which could be derived from what Daniel Feinstein was introducing. What are the 6 steps of the genocides? The analysis of the steps for genocides are meant not simply to verify whether in the judgment of a genocide all the steps are respected, but possibly to see whether some of these steps could be blocked before they are happening, because the juridical qualification of genocides or crimes against humanity by definition should not meant to be a judgment a posteriori, but is put forward to the society in order to be able to prevent or in order to counteract, to create a different culture in order to impede that something could happen. In this sense, I am here, I am not a person expert in juridical matters. I am by profession a medical doctor doing research in a research institution since many years, but I am representing here something or an institution which is an international non-profit organization which is called the Permanent People Tribunal, which has been established many years ago just to try to see whether something could be done by the civil society to first make clear and widely open to the society the questions which Daniel Feinstein posed before the principles, what to do when in fact we are facing facts which coincide with the genocidal processes, and processes are something which are going on and are in fact observed while they are happening. They are not existing only when they are entering a tribunal. And the problem is, in fact, whether from the point of view of the civil society, which means from the point of view of people, those who are possibly candidates to be victims of genocidal process, something could be done to be part of a prevention exercise. In order to show that, I divided my presentation brief, don't worry, in 3 points. One is the historical side, and that is something which I comment briefly here. The second, I take some of the examples we had to face during the history of the Permanent People Tribunal, just to conclude with very few principles. The historical part is very old on one side, if we see the time of history, but is very close to the time we are discussing for the Rohingya. If you see the years of the 70s, we were hearing before that the history of Rohingya was starting at that point. The history of Cambodia was starting and in fact was expressing itself during the 70s. And at the same time, as you see here, the perception of the critical importance, so that was perceived at the very beginning by the Russell Sartre Tribunal on Vietnam, which was anticipating very clearly what was called the crime of silence. Everything was happening, the Vietnam was bombed, everybody was knowing that, but the international community was meant to defend the juridical principle of the Universal Declaration or the agreement, was in fact silent, if not complice in what was happening. And the crime of silence in Vietnam was faced in 2 sessions in 66 and 67. It's interesting to see that France, which was after the 68, all the happening, was in a position with de Gaulle was so against the fact that the people could say something about what states were doing that the session planned to be held in Paris was forbidden just 1 week before it took action. And they had to move outside to see that even the idea that a group without power, except the power of talking aloud about what was happening, was made for the states. That was the beginning of the second experience of the Russell Tribunal, where I was part, because Lelio Basso was an Italian politician and activist, was the president after having been the rapporteur for the Russell Tribunal. And he was introducing something which was important, very important explicitly for the modern versions of genocides. The dictatorships in Latin America, which were in fact covering practically whole region, were the product of an alliance between military and economic power. One of the sessions of the Russell Tribunal on Latin America was on the specific role of transnational corporations in producing a situation of repression and massive violation of human rights, and in fact, what was the roots of what happened in Latin America. We were in '76, the Vietnam War was at the end, and that was important, '75. The colonial era was at the end, the last colonies of Portugal and others were disappearing, but the perception of those who had participated to the Russell Tribunal say that everything was starting again. That was in fact a time of changing, and the new mechanism for the violation of the right of people were put into action through the, in practice, a mechanism of disappearance of the people, and in that sense, the Universal Declaration of the Right of People in Algiers. Can you change to the other one? Because I think that I am sorry for some mistakes here. No, the other one was before. In Algiers was in fact a tentative by academician, representative of people, to declare formally that there was something which was wrong structurally in the international law. Because international law was systematically producing something which was in fact putting aside the real problems which were happening in the world, like the dictatorships in Latin America, which were supported very intensively by Europe, for instance, not only from the States, and also the other cases that we will examine briefly. And in that sense, what were the purpose of these? Okay, we had three. Sorry for this technical my analphabetism, but the Permanent People Tribunal was set up as a body which could work on the basis of the free participation of experts in juridical matters, but not only experts in juridical matters. Anticipating what Daniel was saying very clearly, that the crimes against humanity and genocides are in fact social processes. Is the society which should be present in the jury of a Permanent People Tribunal to really accompany what was happening and what could be done in order to redress. And then there were Nobel Prizes from Garcia Marquez, recently disappeared, to Galeano, to George Wald, Nobel Prizes in medicine for the rediscovery of the mechanism of vision. There was another, Sean McBride, who was Nobel Prize for Peace. But there were also men and women, bishops and activists of the lefts, to see that is the society which was in fact called to nominate their representative in order to judge, to listen and to witnesses, with three goals: to fill an increasing structural vacuum of international law, The second is very important, to provide a tribune of visibility and identity. People were those who had to talk, to speak about. They were not simply called by judges to say what there were truths. They were really produce a narrative of what was their experience, and an experience which was not represented at the international level, and to promote the development of an interpretation of juridical principle which should be or should have the courage of innovating international law. International law has a temptation to be the custos of what has been established. Now, international law should really something which could possibly anticipate what could be the project of a society, not simply to judge what is wrong in a society. And the cases which we afforded, I don't pretend to comment everything on that sense, otherwise it would be too long, but to give you the idea that some of the cases that over the years the tribunal had to face, not because we decided, but because the representative of people were asking us to take over, because the international community was refusing, though the cases were very clear. And then you could easily recognize across those cases many of the key words which have been used also before. The words of, say, existence. I think that was the first one which disappeared here. Is interesting because the Western, there is a point number one which disappeared, and which is the first case, which was the case of the Western Sahara. The case of Western Sahara is still a case which is open. It's a case of a people which exists as a tradition, oral tradition, not so much written tradition. It does not exist. They do not have document to see that the land belonged to them, that the culture belonged to them. They have been part of a deal between colonial powers. And when the colonial power of Spain disappears and the Morocco was entering the new colonial era with the support of the USA and France, which was disappearing from Northern Africa, the Western Sahara was a non-existence. They don't have an identity. And if you are not existent, everything could happen, from being beyond the wall, whatever. It is interesting that the first of this tribunal, for the first time produced, and the verdict of the tribunal was the first identity of of these people as possibly recognized by the international community, because we were describing in juridical terms, in social terms, what was the history of that body, and it was used by the Organization of African States to introduce the Western Sahara population into the international arena. And the text was used also later on, and now the Western Sahara, the problem is still open for self-determination, but in fact is an official component of the international community, a bit like the Palestinians, observer or not international community. They are there, and there are now missions to investigate that. Then we could go on for the genocidal process in Argentina, which was a very possibly innovative interpretation of the term of genocide applied to the desaparecidos and all those who were representing a project of a society. And the idea was that the genocide is also what is able to destroy the capacity of a society to have a different project with it. What Daniel was saying, which is a critical point, the otherness, which could be assumed by those who have the power, whenever they declare that the otherness is an enemy and this is a threat to this national or international now security. Then you could go on and you could say, for instance, that the Armenian genocide, which was quoted correctly on the day ago, as the model case of genocide, which is still open in the international scene, nobody was daring to deal with that. And then we decided, on the request of the community of the Armenian diaspora to open that. And it's interesting again, we were forced to have the process not in a public place in France. We were the guest of the University of La Sorbonne on the name of the freedom of the university. Otherwise, were not allowed to have a public space because of the political implication. So that to give the idea of the political importance of this situation, I think there is different things, the crime of impunity, and I put together in Latin America after the dictatorships, the processes of investigation on what happened was a very long process. It's still ongoing. We have been asked recently by Brazil, which is one of the leading countries now, to go back to the document of the Russell Tribunal on Latin America to investigate what was happening in the name of the memory. But at the same time, there was the impunity for industrial disasters, which were a new wave, not producing directly, possibly genocides. In the technical term, though what is happening in land grabbing is different, but for instance, the multiplication of industrial disasters, Bhopal, Chernobyl, which are considered outside the competence of the international community. And the Bhopal case was in fact investigated here in London to see what could be really the responsibility. One session which was important, and then you could go on, was the session where in the 50th century of the conquest of America, there was a decision of the tribunal with the support of various juridical persons just to look back to the origin of international law. You know that international law was established conceptually by theologians and juridical persons just to justify the conquest of America, to say that the conquest of America was in fact a process of civilization. The name was in the name of commerce and gospel. The two ideological and practical things which were great ally. If you translate that into two terms of globalization, you find exactly the same process. On the name of a combination of economic interest and ideological vision of the world, you declare that the future must be in the hands of those who are the preacher of the gospel and are the owner of the economic power. And in this sense, you could have then impunity for economic crimes, and then the genocidal process of ex-Yugoslavia. We were anticipating, if you see the years, what was then the big problem of the International Criminal Court, but because the process were ongoing immediately after the Rwanda, 94, 97, were ongoing, and there was really a pressure to declare that what was happening was not simply a diplomatic political choice of bombing or not, I finished, but was something which was having victims, and then the fact of war as international crime and the genocidal process against Elan Tamil, the Sri Lanka, which was the last point. Just to conclude, you see that possibly there are three principles we think are important, are in fact reflected in what we are discussing here. Victims must be considered with total priority, the real subjects and the terms of reference of international law, not the principle of international law. Principle of international law must respond to the victims, not the victims should comply with the principle of international law. That is something which is very clearly explicit in a verdict of the Permanent People Tribunal in 2010 for the multinational. The second point is really another of the open problem, that Permanent People Tribunal is not against obviously international law, just to say lets international law have door and window open for the new needs and the new requests. And the problem of calling with its name what happens to real people on real time, not waiting for Cambodia to wait so many years, and is still waiting. Certainly must be said something, but it's important to call by name the denomination of crimes and the rights of people when they are happening as soon as possible, when people are really alive or dead, but with a process which is ongoing. Otherwise, the delayed court judgment, concentrated also on personal only responsibility, could hide the real nature of a social process, which is not the product of individuals. Otherwise, we have always a wrong concept of the protection and prevention, and in this sense, the practice of permanent people tribunal and opinion tribunal could become really, as it has become, an exercise of alphabetization of the society. I put one country which was in that sense very, very interesting on the Philippines when there was the dictatorship of Marcos. The process of the tribunal was filmed by the Algerian supporter of the Filipino resistance, and that was used for a public school out in the field to show that those people were existing. They were known. They were not simply denied by the dictatorship. And the same is true for Colombia and Mexico. And I do really hope that the same will happen also to the people of Rohingya. Thanks.